loves, my name is Amber, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be discussing These Violent Delights by Micah Nemerever. Before we get too far into the review, I did want to mention a few trigger warnings that were relevant to the book, including death, mourning, suicide mentions, physical assault, sexual assault, self-harm, violent fantasies, emotional abuse, homophobia, including the use of the F-slur, and murder. So if any of these things are liable to be incredibly bothersome or triggering to you, please have extreme discretion while watching the rest of this review or reading the book. For anybody who chooses to prioritize diversity on their bookshelf, this book features queer and Jewish characters, both of which are shared identities with the author himself, so it is coming from a little bit of a place of authority. But with all of that being addressed, let's go ahead and talk about the book itself. The story follows college freshman Paul through the development of his relationship with fellow student Julian, as they become dangerously codependent with one another, and the lines between love and hate start to blur, driving them to dark and desperate measures to keep each other on the line. Normally, I would go into much more detail about the specifics of the plot. However, in doing so would reveal a lot of the different plot twists and mystery of the book, so I do think I'm going to keep it a bit vague for this one. Another important thing to note, however, is that the book is set during the 1970s, so that does add a bit to the vibe of the plot line and some of the outlining elements that add to the characters' experiences. Not in a very dramatic way, like, if I hadn't been told it was the 1970s, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that it was the 70s, but you can definitely tell that it's not necessarily modern day, but not at all in a bad way. I actually really liked the slight vintage vibes that the book gave off, especially considering that a lot of the vibes that accompanied the book as well were very much like dark academia and like cool winter read kind of vibes. So it definitely all fit together really nicely. I feel like one of the primary plot elements of the book was the chronicling of the dangerous codependence and all-encompassing nature that young love can take on, and the emotional turmoil that that can cause when the energy isn't necessarily completely matched on both sides. And while this book definitely does take that to the extreme, I think a lot of people who happen to feel those kind of romantic ties when they were younger will definitely be able to relate to the intensity of the emotion. Throughout the book, there are also a lot of undertones of managing grief, and while I personally, thankfully, don't necessarily have enough experience with death to be able to completely confirm the nature of those experiences, the emotion does feel so raw and real and intimate that I have to imagine that it is fairly realistic. So the beginning half of the book was definitely like a nice little taste into the college vibes that I personally didn't get to experience, as Julian and Paul are freshman students in college. One of them still living at home, one of them living on their own in campus housing. And it was kind of fun to just get that like idealist dark academia kind of vibes. It didn't necessarily last the entire book as, you know, the plot progresses and a lot of other elements come into play, but it was just a nice little taste of what I feel like I missed. And the last 100 pages or so of the book, because like it is quite a long book, I believe it's 400 and something pages, and the last 100 pages or so literally had me nearly holding my breath and just like desperation to figure out how the mystery was going to unfold and like what information was going to come to light and what was going to happen. And it's been a really long time since I feel like I've had that much anticipation for the ending of a book, whereas normally I'm able to like more so enjoy the reading experience, which like it's not like that wasn't the case for this book. I very much enjoyed the reading experience, and honestly, like while I was actively reading the book, I was already wanting to reread it because I found it so enjoyable and interesting to read. But those last 100 pages or so, I was just like, I need this to be done immediately so I know what happened. And I feel like it was mostly satisfying. There was definitely a little bit to the ending to where I was kind of like, huh, not really where I thought that was gonna go, but not necessarily in a bad or a negative way, just in a curious kind of way. I feel like it was satisfying in the fact that it was unsatisfying and like things were resolved and yet unresolved, and I know none of that's gonna make sense unless you read the book, but it was genuinely a really enjoyable read, and I liked the mystery aspect of it because too, like, the prologue of the book starts us off with like a small chapter of, you know, introducing us to this one character who gets picked up by two teen boys who happen to be Paul and Julian, and they end up drugging this other character, and that's where the prologue cuts off. So then we have to go backwards and start from the very beginning and find out who Paul is, and then we find out who Julian is, and then we go through this entire progression of like the decline of their mental health and their desperation to keep each other with them. So it was like they immediately get you on the line and get you invested and interested in what the fuck is going on, and then you have to backtrack and completely go through the whole story, which, as frustrating as it was, I feel like was a really, really good way to develop the book, and it was probably the best route that Nemerever could have taken, because I personally didn't necessarily find the book to be terribly slow, but I did happen to get a glimpse of a few Goodreads reviews, and a lot of people thought that it was really slow. I do very much disagree. I think they were missing a lot of, you know, the specifics and the subtle setup of a lot of the elements. So I didn't find it to be slow at all, but considering the fact that some other people did, I think that it was really good that the prologue like gets you hooked, so that way it's going to keep you interested in reading to the very end. I personally found the writing to be a bit eloquent in a way that had me like actively having to fully pay attention to what was going on, but not in like a tedious way. Because there are definitely like books that I've read to where it's like so eloquent, it just feels unnecessarily pretentious and I have to pay attention and it's like pulling teeth trying to get through it. Whereas this was very much the opposite. Like it was very much eloquent and I had to actively pay attention to what I was reading, but in a pleasant way that made me actively want to do that instead of feeling like it was difficult to get through. And even with that considered, it was still a fairly quick read. Like I was able to finish it within a couple of days, and I probably could have finished it even faster if I had had more time to just completely binge it. Which, I mean, there were definitely like certain chunks of the book that I very much was binging just because I wanted to find out what was going to happen next. Especially like I feel like the last like 200 pages or so were probably just like a binge read within one night because I was just wanting to know what happened. But no, I thought that the writing was very, very eloquent. And I genuinely cannot believe that this is Nemerever's debut novel. He hasn't published anything prior to this, if I'm remembering correctly, and that completely blew me away. It was a bit disappointing because I wasn't able to like look up and be like, oh, what other books has he written, because I want to read them. Unfortunately, we do have to wait to see if he publishes anything else. I do have hope because I think he's also a little bit of a younger author as well. So I have hope that he's going to have a long writing career in front of him because it was so good. I so desperately want to read more of his work and get more character development from him because I found these particular characters to be fascinating. You know, the nature of there being two queer men who are young. They weren't even like necessarily like current traditional college age. They were teenagers, like they were 16. But also, you know, the adult element of being expected to be adults and living on their own or going to college and all of that while still being at the height of their emotional development and the intensity of the emotions being so much more dramatic than they would be had they been fully matured adults, I thought was the perfect backdrop for this plot of elements to conspire. I just think that it was a really, really good setup all around, and it added a lot to the characterization of the characters and a lot of their, you know, motives and underlying emotions and experiences. I just feel like it was very, very well thought out, and I was very impressed by the book, quite frankly. And it's been a while since I've been so thoroughly impressed by a book. Now, I can definitely see how this wouldn't necessarily be everybody's cup of tea. And in fact, I feel like a lot of the reviews that I did happen to peek at, granted, I didn't go super in depth into like reading reviews. I like to kind of formulate my own opinion before putting it out into the world. I don't like to be super influenced by other people's necessarily. But when I was, you know, shelving the book on Goodreads, I did happen to notice some poor reviews, and I was very curious to see what they had to say about it. And a lot of people, I found, like, a lot of people were making the arguments that it was a little slow, which I do disagree. I think they were just missing some of the subtleties and character spiraling, almost, is kind of how I want to explain it. Two, a lot of people didn't get the queer aspect of the book, which I think is a very large motivating element into the text. And a lot of people also, oh my God, it was very uncomfortable. Some people were just like, oh, if you're going to make it queer, like, you're not giving us any sex scenes. And like a lot of people were disappointed by the elements of intimacy that were featured in the book. What was featured was pretty ambiguous, and you could like imply that they were having sex, but you weren't necessarily fully confirmed or denied. It could have just been, you know, varying degrees of different things. They weren't blatant or graphic about it, which I very much appreciated because, one, the characters are underage. So, like, I don't want to be reading about teenagers having sex as an adult. Like, that's gross. And two, I didn't, you know, it very much was not fetishizing the queer aspect of it. And I feel like that's what people wanted and were calling for in the reviews. And I was just very, very uncomfortable by that because I'm like, can you guys really not interact with queer literature without it being hypersexualized? Like, sounds like a fetish to me. And then two, again, they were minors. They were 16. So like all these people who were like, I wanted sexier and steamier sex scenes. Like, why? Unless you're also that age. Like if you're a teenager and looking for that relatability of, you know, younger sexual activities within the book, like I'd get that. But as people who are adults reviewing books, I was kind of just like, ew. Like, why do we want to see the teenagers having sex? Gross. So that was definitely an interesting element and like a lot of interesting arguments that people were making. I, for the most part, very much disagreed with. So hopefully if you're here, you're more on my side of like that kind of understanding. Now, the book was, with the exception of the prologue, told mostly from Paul's point of view. It wasn't necessarily like a first-person perspective, but we were more so following Paul than anyone else. While obviously like we do get a lot of Julian, it's more so from Paul's perspective of Julian's experience. So I would say Paul is definitely the main character, with Julian being like a secondary main character. I wouldn't go so far as to say he was a secondary character, but he definitely like wasn't the primary perspective that we were following. And I do have to say that it was intimately terrifying to witness like the complete subconscious levels of hatred that Paul had for himself that was obvious with like nearly every page of the book. It was so all-consuming. Not in a way that made it like a drag to read about, but just like he had such a deep level of like unconscious self-hatred for himself, and he desperately just wanted Julian's affections and love. But anytime he got any ounce of it, he always managed to convince himself that there was like ulterior motives to it, and he wasn't able to just accept any love and affection that was bestowed upon him. And I do have to say, unfortunately, that I did relate to that a lot more than I was comfortable with, seeing the character capable of such dark atrocities. But I do have to say that it's more of like, at this point, secondhand relatability, because like thankfully I am in a much healthier mental space now to where I don't experience those kinds of levels of self-hatred. But when I was Paul's age, when I was a teenager and when I was in high school, I definitely felt the all-consuming just emotion of that, and I definitely relate to the core of the emotion. Certainly not in the violent fantasies and behaviors. Like, thankfully, as self-destructive as I was, I never had any, like, violent thoughts or feelings towards any other people, and it was never, like, outward. It was always just, like, self-destructive and inward. And thankfully, I'm in a much healthier mental space now, so for the most part, that's not necessarily, like, a thing that I experience anymore. But it was very upsetting to find so much relatability in such a dark character. But I also think that that was part of the point. Like, I do think that Nemerever as an author wanted some people to relate to the core a little bit, especially because the book was very, very loosely based on a real life couple and homicide. And you know, I read the author's note, like, at the end of the book, or the afterword, or whatever it's called with this particular book. And Nemerever does go a little bit into the concept of wanting to explore the depths of the dark emotions that you're ingrained to be afraid of, and that you're told these horror stories and things, and you're always, you know, scared that, like, if you're able to relate to them, that makes you the same and makes you capable of doing those things. And I think for Nemerever, like, it was kind of expressed that this was an indulgence in the fantasies of the darkness that you know you would never actually do, but you're conditioned to be afraid that you're capable of. Obviously, like, Nemerever is able to express his own opinions and feelings better. So, like, I would definitely, if you're going to read the book, I would definitely recommend reading the afterword and all of the associated, like, notes at the end, because it gives you a bit more insight into the reasoning behind this particular story. It was very, very fascinating, and I do think I completely get what Nemerever was going for. So I found it, you know, that much deeper and more intimately interesting. Whereas I could definitely see some people just not really getting it or not so much relating, which is totally fine. Obviously, not everybody's going to have the exact same feelings about literature. That's, you know, kind of the point. But I do think that I was amongst part of the target audience for this book. So I found it to be a fun read, and it's definitely one that I do see myself reading again and again. Maybe not so immediately, like, I'll definitely wait a few months, like, maybe won't read it till next year, but I do very much want to reread the book, and I do very highly want to recommend this book to some people. But if you have any interest in checking out the book for yourself, I do personally very highly recommend it, and would love to hear some of your guys' thoughts on the book if you yourselves have read it at all, because obviously, you know, based on some of the other reviews that I was seeing, there are definitely a lot of mixed reviews and feelings about it, so I'd love to have a conversation about it if any of you guys have read it as well. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I had a blast hanging out with y'all. Peace.